Main focus of the task is as follows. Make sure to understand the initial work procedures required when commissioning the refrigeration system. When installing a temperature sensor, it should be insulated so that it does not get interfered with the external temperature. To secure the competitor's safety and protect the equipment, set the safety devices such as high pressure and a low pressure controller and a condenser fan controller before conducting the procedure. Be careful since the compressor may be overheated due to low pressure during the startup. Charge the refrigeration system with the required amount of refrigerant while checking the sight glass in the system. In order to maintain the required temperature, control the capacity control valve, capacity regulator. Control each valve to set a normal superheat. Control the suction pressure control valve to prevent the compressor from being overloaded in the beginning. Write the test sheet to measure the overall performance of the refrigeration system. When writing the test sheet, all data should be measured in the shortest time as much as possible. Make sure to be familiar with unit and understand how to convert it into another. Please check the preparations and tools for this training. These are precautions. When commissioning, make sure to be cautious of overheating and liquid compression of the compressor. Before commissioning the system, make sure to install an AC ammeter to check the operating current. When disconnecting the manifold gauge, the amount of loss in the refrigerant must be extremely small. Mixed refrigerants should be charged in a liquid state slowly in small amounts to the liquid receiver side by around 80% of the fixed amount with the compressor stopped, and to the suction pipe side by around 20% of the fixed amount with the compressor running. During commissioning, carefully observe whether overcurrent, liquid hammer, or overheating compression of the compressor occurs, and if a problem is found, identify the cause and take measures immediately. The sensor part for measuring the temperature should be fixed closely to the pipe and should be insulated. The electrical insulation test must be conducted before supplying power to the control box. If insulation has no problems, wear insulation gloves, then supply power. Please check what you are going to perform on this task. Commissioning the refrigeration system. Wear an appropriate safety gear for the working environment. Run commissioning the refrigeration system. Operate the compressor and condenser fan of the refrigeration system with the switch in the control box. Open the low-pressure side valve of the manifold gauge and slowly charge the refrigerant. If the system is overcharged with the refrigerant from the beginning, problems such as liquid hammer, high-pressure rise, and overcurrent may occur, so be careful not to overcharge it. Mixed refrigerant should be charged in a liquid state slowly in small amounts to the liquid receiver side by around 80% of the fixed amount with the compressor stopped, and to the suction pipe side by around 20% of the fixed amount with the compressor running. Control the setting for commissioning the system with a capacity control valve, capacity regulator. The capacity control valve must maintain a constant saturated suction temperature. The design saturated suction temperature currently suggested to the work is -16 degrees Celsius. Pressure drop in the suction pipeline, 1 K. Temperature sensors are installed to measure overheating and overcooling. The temperature must be measured on the evaporator outlet and the condenser outlet. Excessive overcooling may cause high pressure to rise and liquid back where the refrigerant that has not yet evaporated enters the compressor from the evaporator. This deteriorates the performance of the refrigerator and shortens the life of the compressor. Usually, the subcooling is set as 5 K. In terms of the worker's controller and system settings, if the temperature is 5 K lower than the designed saturated suction temperature, the low-pressure controller starts to operate, stopping the system operation. Adjust the expansion valve. The adjustment for the expansion valve opening is a way of setting the appropriate superheat. It is very important to enhance the performance of the refrigeration system. Generally, the superheat should be around 5 K and should not be set too high. With the suction pressure control valve, KVL, set the maximum suction pressure which the compressor is able to suck while the refrigeration cycle runs. If the set pressure is too low, the amount of the refrigerant circulation decreases, deteriorating the refrigeration effect, and if it is too high, overheating may damage the compressor. Set the compressor to operate below the rated operating current so that it does not strain the compressor. Adjust the capacity control valve and the suction pressure control valve repeatedly to meet the required set conditions of the system. Capacity control valve, capacity regulator, controls the capacity of compressor and the actual load of evaporator suitably. The compressor suction pressure should be maintained at a constant pressure by supplying hot gas from the high pressure side to the low pressure side through the bypass pipe of high and low pressure connecting the discharge side and the suction side of the refrigerator. The current worker should adjust the saturated suction temperature -16 degrees Celsius of system. Adjust the suction pressure control valve so that the system evaporation temperature is set at the required constant pressure. Insulate all areas where condensation may occur and all piping right after the expansion valve of the refrigerator to the suction side of the compressor. Elastomeric rubber thermal insulation or Artelon insulation may be used for reserving heat and cold. In case of using the rubber foam insulation, glue the split part with the adhesive glue. After the refrigerant charging is completed, close the charging valve on the refrigerant cylinder. Close the service valve of the liquid receiver connected to the high-pressure side of the manifold gauge and let the residual refrigerant in the manifold gauge slowly flow to the suction tube using pressure difference to minimize residual gas inside the hose of the manifold gauge. After the remaining refrigerant is all sucked in, remove the manifold gauge from the cylinder. When removing manifold gauges, only extremely small amounts of refrigerant shall be released into the atmosphere. After completing the refrigerant charging, the refrigerant cylinder should be capped and then the leakage test should be conducted with a gas detector. Using a refrigerant scale, measure the weight of refrigerant cylinder to check the charged amount of refrigerant. Completing a system commissioning sheet. Data sheet shall be written when it is close to the design temperature as much as possible and in a safe and normal operating condition. System commissioning sheet consists of ambient temperature, refrigerant type, mass of refrigerant charge, suction pressure, discharge pressure, condenser subcooling, total system superheat, LP control on, LP control off, HP control on, HP control off, capacity regulator setting, cold water temperature, hot water temperature, compressor operating current. Write down the ambient temperature by measuring the temperature around the system. Write down the refrigerant type charged to the refrigeration system. Suction pressure is also known as low pressure and can be measured with the manifold gauge or low pressure gauge installed on the equipment. Discharge pressure is also known as high pressure and can be measured with the high pressure part of manifold gauge. The degree of supercooling of the condenser represents the difference between the high pressure saturation temperature and the condenser outlet temperature. The degree of superheating of the overall system represents the difference between the suction saturation temperature and the compressor suction temperature. Record the temperature of cold and hot water. Check and record the measured values on the temperature controller. Compressor operating current refers to the current in which the compressor is operated. Measure and record with a clamp meter. Calculate the pressure values for operation and stop of LP and HP control. The setting values of LP and HP control are described in the task requirements. The low pressure cutout switch should be recorded at -10 degrees Celsius saturated suction temperature. The unit of data sheet is kilopascals, so record by converting the unit into the corresponding saturated pressure valve. The low pressure cutout switch should be blocked when it is lower than the designed saturated suction temperature by 5 K. As designed saturated suction temperature is -16 degrees Celsius and 5 K means the difference value. The low pressure cutout switch shall be switched off at -21 degrees Celsius. Therefore, the pressure value corresponding to -21 degrees Celsius should be recorded, and the actual pressure switch setting values should be in accord. The low pressure cutout switch shall be switched on at -10 degrees Celsius. The pressure value corresponding to -10 degrees Celsius should be recorded, and the actual pressure switch setting values should be in accord. Since the pressure and temperature are proportional, the condensation temperature is the saturated temperature corresponding to the discharge pressure. If the discharge pressure reaches the saturated pressure of 65 degrees Celsius, the system must stop. The pressure value corresponding to 65 degrees Celsius shall be recorded, and the actual pressure switch setting values shall be in accord. Since 10 K is the deviation value, it operates when the saturated pressure corresponds to 55 degrees Celsius. The pressure value corresponding to 55 degrees Celsius shall be recorded, and the actual pressure switch values shall be in accord. Since the capacity controller setting is required to maintain the saturated suction temperature of -16 degrees Celsius under the requirements of the test project, record -16 degrees Celsius, and the actual capacity control valve setting values shall be in accord. Calculate the total system superheat. The suction saturated temperature is proportional to the suction pressure, so use the refrigerant slider to find the suction saturated temperature. Obtain the deviation value between the suction saturated temperature and the compression suction temperature. This deviation value is the degree of superheating of the system. Calculate the degree of supercooling of the condenser. Since the pressure and temperature are proportional, use the refrigerant slider to find the condenser's saturated temperature. Find the deviation value between the high pressure saturated temperature value and the condenser outlet temperature. This deviation value is the degree of supercooling of the condenser. Check again the key points of the task we've worked on in this training. In this training, we have learned commissioning and test sheet creation. Everybody, thank you for your hard works.